In the winter of 1944, while American infantrymen slept in frozen foxholes scraped into the mud of the Hurtgen forest, curled around their rifles, shivering under a single wool blanket, waking every few hours to the sound of artillery, and the gnawing fear that a German patrol might be crawling through the tree line. General Dwight Eisenhower retired to a heated suite in the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles. The room had a private bathroom, clean sheets changed daily by orderlies, a writing desk, blackout curtains, and a bed with a proper mattress. His aide had laid out fresh uniform trousers for the morning. A pot of coffee would arrive before dawn. 20 kilometers from where men were dying, in conditions indistinguishable from the Western Front of 1917, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe slept in conditions that would have been considered comfortable by any peacetime civilian standard. This was not an accident, not a moral failing, and not a secret. No, it was policy. A deliberate, calculated decision rooted in a military philosophy that stretched back thousands of years and reached its most sophisticated expression during the Second World War. The premise was straightforward and, by the brutal logic of industrialized warfare, irrefutable. A general who sleeps badly makes decisions that kill thousands. The cost of a comfortable bed was measured not in luxury, but in lives. We rarely think about how commanders slept during wartime. The popular imagination fills itself with maps and strategy rooms, with dramatic speeches and battlefield tours, with the visible machinery of leadership. But behind every major decision of the Second World War, every invasion plan, every bombing campaign, every allocation of reserves that determined whether a sector held or collapsed, was a human brain that required rest to function. The science of sleep was poorly understood in the 1940s compared to today. But military planners did not need peer-reviewed studies to grasp the observable reality. A commander deprived of sleep for 48 hours became measurably slower in processing information, more rigid in his thinking, more prone to irritability and poor judgment, and dramatically more likely to make catastrophic errors under pressure. The stakes were not abstract. When a platoon leader operating on 3 hours of sleep misread a map, 30 men might walk into an ambush. When an army group commander operating on 3 hours of sleep misread an intelligence report, 30,000 men might be committed to an offensive that had already been anticipated by the enemy. The mathematics of command responsibility meant that the higher a general's rank, the greater the consequences of his cognitive impairment, and therefore the greater the institutional investment in ensuring he slept well, ate properly, and maintained some minimal baseline of physical and mental functioning. The comfort afforded to Allied generals during the Second World War was not a privilege stolen from the men who fought under them. It was a weapon system, as deliberately maintained as any aircraft or artillery piece, designed to keep the decision-making apparatus of an entire army operating at maximum capacity. The principle was ancient. Alexander the Great campaigned with a personal tent of considerable luxury and furnished with carpets, cushions, and captured Persian treasures that served both as rest quarters and as a visual assertion of power. Roman generals on campaign occupied the Praetorium, the largest and most centrally located tent in the legionary camp, attended by personal slaves, cooks, and scribes. Napoleon traveled with a custom-designed field bed, a folding iron frame cot with a horsehair mattress and silk curtains, that could be assembled by his valet in minutes and provided a sleep surface that, while modest by palace standards, was vastly superior to anything available to his soldiers sleeping on straw or bare ground. The Duke of Wellington, famously austere by aristocratic standards, nonetheless maintained a personal campaign wagon equipped with a proper bed, portable writing desk, and storage for wine and personal provisions. Even Frederick the Great, who cultivated a reputation for sharing the hardships of his troops, slept in heated quarters with a dedicated staff whenever conditions permitted. The historical record is consistent across centuries and civilizations. Commanders who neglected their own rest made worse decisions, and the armies that recognized this reality performed better than those that did not. The Second World War did not invent the principle. It industrialized it. But the scale of the Second World War created challenges that no previous conflict had approached. This was not a war led by a single general riding at the head of a column. Allied operations in Europe alone involved a command structure encompassing dozens of generals and hundreds of senior staff officers coordinating the simultaneous movements of millions of men across multiple countries. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force may establish to plan and execute the invasion of Western Europe, employed over 16,000 personnel at its peak, a bureaucracy larger than many peacetime government ministries. The decisions flowing through this headquarters affected every front from the English Channel to the Rhine, and the men making those decisions worked hours that would be considered extreme by any professional standard. 16-hour days were routine. During crisis periods, the weeks before D-Day, named the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the final push across the Rhine, senior commanders regularly worked 20 hours or more before collapsing into whatever sleep they could manage. The institutional challenge was not merely providing a comfortable bed. It was creating an environment in which exhausted men making life and death decisions for millions could recover enough cognitive function in 4 to 6 hours of sleep to perform effectively the following day. The solution? For the highest-ranking Allied commanders was a system of headquarters accommodations that balanced operational functionality with deliberate physical comfort. In England, before the invasion of Normandy, senior American generals were housed in requisitioned country estates scattered across the southern counties. Eisenhower's pre-invasion headquarters was at Southwick House near Portsmouth, a Georgian manor with spacious rooms, manicured grounds, and a staff of British and American orderlies who maintained the property to a standard that would have been unremarkable at a well-run English hotel. His personal quarters included a private bedroom, a sitting room, and access to a kitchen that could prepare meals at irregular hours, essential for a commander whose schedule bore no relationship to normal civilian mealtimes. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st U.S. Army, was based at Bristol in similarly comfortable quarters. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, operated from a converted school near Portsmouth, where his personal caravan, a captured Italian command vehicle refitted to his specifications, contained a narrow but adequate bed, a small desk, and a collection of caged canaries that he kept for companionship. Montgomery's sleeping habits were legendary and deliberate. He went to bed at precisely 9:30 every evening, regardless of the operational situation, and refused to be woken before 6:30 in the morning, except in cases of absolute emergency. His staff learned quickly that absolute emergency meant nothing less than a full-scale enemy breakthrough. His reasoning was characteristically blunt. A tired general was a dangerous general, and he intended to be neither. Once the Allied armies moved on to the continent, the accommodation system adapted with remarkable speed. As forces advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany, us senior commanders were typically housed in requisitioned chateaux, manor houses, hotels, or the most substantial civilian buildings available in each area. The criteria were practical as much as comfortable. A headquarters needed space for map rooms, communications equipment, staff offices, and security perimeters, and the large, solidly built structures of the European aristocracy and upper bourgeoisie provided all of these naturally. In Eisenhower's successive continental headquarters included the Château de Gueux near Reims, the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles, and ultimately the former IG Farben building in Frankfurt. Each provided private quarters with proper beds, heating, running water, and dedicated domestic staff. The contrast with the conditions endured by frontline troops was stark and fully acknowledged by the commanders themselves. Yes, Eisenhower wrote in letters to his wife that he felt guilty about his comfort while men under his command were freezing in the field. Bradley recorded similar sentiments in his memoirs, but neither considered the arrangement negotiable. The alternative, a senior commander trying to direct operations involving hundreds of thousands of men while sleeping in a tent on a cot, waking unrested, eating cold rations, and processing intelligence briefings through a fog of fatigue, was not a demonstration of solidarity. It was a dereliction of duty. The British approach was broadly similar, but carried its own cultural inflections. Montgomery's personal habits set the tone for the entire 21st Army Group staff. His tactical headquarters was deliberately small, mobile, and efficient, a cluster of caravans and tents that could relocate within hours. But within that austere framework, his personal sleeping arrangements were sacrosanct. His caravan was maintained by a dedicated orderly who ensured clean bedding a precise room temperature, and absolute quiet during sleeping hours. Staff officers who violated the noise protocols around Montgomery's caravan quickly discovered that the field marshal's temper was at least as formidable as his tactical reputation. Other senior British commanders maintained their own versions of this discipline. General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, operated from a series of Italian villas that provided the dual advantages of operational space and personal comfort. Heated rooms, functioning bathrooms, and kitchens staffed by military cooks who could produce meals on demand. The Mediterranean theater, despite its brutal combat conditions in the Italian mountains, offered headquarters environments that were often remarkably civilized by frontline standards. Alexander was known to insist on proper dinners with his senior staff, white tablecloths, multiple courses, wine, not from vanity, but from a conviction that the ritual of a civilized meal anchored the mental health of men operating under extraordinary pressure. The dinner table became a decompression chamber, a place where the accumulated tension of the day could be released in conversation before the night's rest. The Americans developed their own systematic approach to what the military bureaucracy termed command sustainment. Behind the individual arrangements for specific generals lay an institutional infrastructure designed to keep the entire senior officer corps functioning at high levels over long periods. This infrastructure included dedicated mess facilities that served nutritionally balanced meals prepared by trained military cooks. It had medical officers assigned specifically to monitor the health and fatigue levels of senior commanders and, perhaps most importantly, a staff system designed to allow generals to actually sleep by ensuring that competent subordinates managed the operational flow during the commander's rest hours. The duty officer system, in which a senior staff member assumed responsibility for monitoring the situation overnight and was authorized to make routine decisions without waking the commander. It was not merely administrative convenience, it was a sleep protection mechanism. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, was famous for his explosive energy and aggressive tempo, but even Patton maintained a disciplined rest schedule when circumstances permitted. His headquarters staff in France and Germany operated on a rotation system that ensured someone was always awake and monitoring the operational situation, allowing Patton to sleep for 6 to 7 hours on most nights. When he could not sleep, during the rapid advance across France in the summer of 1944, or during the desperate pivot north to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, his staff noted visible deterioration in his judgment and temperament within 48 hours. The pattern was universal. Every senior commander, regardless of personal toughness or willpower, degraded predictably and measurably when deprived of adequate rest. The body's need for sleep was as non-negotiable as its need for oxygen. Willpower could delay the consequences. It could not prevent them. The contrast with conditions at the front was not merely one of degree. It was a difference in kind. An infantry private in a foxhole during the winter of 1944 did not sleep in any meaningful sense of the word. He occupied a shallow hole in frozen earth, often partially filled with water or snow, covered by a shelter half or nothing at all, and wearing every article of clothing he possessed, plus whatever he had been able to scavenge. He dozed in intervals of 20 to 40 minutes, waking to the cold, to fear, to the sounds of movement in the darkness that might be friendly patrols or might be the last sound he ever heard. Sleep deprivation at the front was not a manageable inconvenience. It was a chronic, cumulative assault on the human nervous system that produced measurable psychiatric casualties on a massive scale. The U.S. Army's term was combat fatigue, a deliberately vague label that encompassed everything from temporary disorientation to complete psychological breakdown. Medical studies conducted during and after the war established that the average infantryman could sustain continuous frontline combat for approximately 60 to 90 days before some form of psychological collapse became statistically probable, and that sleep deprivation was the single most powerful accelerant of that process. The men who could not sleep could not recover. Men who could not recover could not fight. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army alone had documented over 900,000 hospital admissions for neuropsychiatric conditions, a substantial proportion of which were directly linked to the cumulative effects of exhaustion and chronic sleep deprivation. The common soldier's inability to sleep was killing the Army from within. The military's response to this crisis, the development of rotation policies at rest areas, and the doctrine of pulling frontline units back to rear positions for recovery was, in essence, an attempt to extend to ordinary soldiers some fraction of the sleep protection that generals received automatically. The system was imperfect, inconsistent, and often overwhelmed by operational necessity. Divisions that were supposed to be rotated out of the line after 30 days sometimes remained in combat for 90. Now, rest areas behind the front offered a reprieve from enemy fire, but not always from cold, noise, or the psychological burden that prevented genuine sleep even in safe conditions. But the principle had been established, and it would shape military doctrine for decades to come. The recognition that sleep was not a personal indulgence, but an operational resource, as finite and as critical as ammunition or fuel, and that its systematic management was a command responsibility at every level. The disparity was not unique to the Western Allies. On the Eastern Front, Soviet general officers operated from command posts that, while austere by Western standards, were dramatically more comfortable than anything available to the frontline Soviet soldier. Senior commanders were housed in the most substantial buildings available: schoolhouses, municipal offices, farmhouses selected for their structural integrity and distance from the front. They slept on actual beds, but were served hot meals prepared by dedicated orderlies, and were protected by security detachments that ensured their rest was not interrupted by anything short of a genuine crisis. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, arguably the most important Soviet military commander of the war, maintained a personal routine that prioritized sleep with almost mathematical precision during critical operations. He understood from bitter experience during the desperate battles of 1941 that exhaustion impaired his judgment in ways he could not always detect himself, and he imposed sleep discipline on his staff with the same ruthlessness he applied to every other aspect of military operations. German generals, particularly in the earlier stages of the war, all maintained headquarters standards that reflected both Prussian military tradition and the Wehrmacht's institutional emphasis on staff efficiency. Field marshals and army group commanders operated from requisitioned estates, hotels, and purpose-built command bunkers that included private sleeping quarters, bathing facilities, and mess halls. As the war turned against Germany and the operational tempo of retreat imposed its own chaos, these standards eroded, but the fundamental principle that senior commanders must be rested to function was never abandoned even in the final catastrophic months. The Japanese military represented a partial exception to this pattern, rooted in a cultural and institutional philosophy that placed extreme emphasis on endurance, self-sacrifice, and the subordination of personal comfort to duty. Japanese generals were expected to share more of the hardships of their troops than their Western counterparts, and many genuinely did, sleeping on simple mats in austere quarters, eating the same rations as their staff, and maintaining schedules that allowed minimal rest. But even within this framework, the hierarchical realities of command imposed their own logic. Senior Japanese commanders on major operations were housed in the most protected and functional facilities available, attended by orderlies and staff officers who managed the operational flow to allow their commander to rest. The difference was cultural rather than structural. Japanese generals slept less comfortably than their Allied counterparts, but they still slept more comfortably than their own troops. The gap was narrower, but it existed. It had to. The demands of high-level decision-making imposed biological constraints that no amount of cultural conditioning could override. A brain deprived of sleep functions poorly regardless of the national flag it serves. What the Second World War established, more clearly than any previous conflict, was that sleep is not separable from military effectiveness. The elaborate systems built to ensure that Allied generals slept in reasonable comfort, the requisitioned chateau, the dedicated orderlies, the duty officer rotations, the insistence on regular meals and protected rest hours, were not expressions of aristocratic privilege transplanted onto a modern battlefield. And they were the product of institutional learning accumulated over centuries of warfare, refined by the unprecedented scale and complexity of global industrial conflict, and validated by the observable relationship between commander rest and decision quality. Every comfortable bed that Eisenhower or Montgomery or Bradley slept in was, in the cold calculus of war, an investment in the cognitive capacity required to direct operations involving millions of lives. Yet the moral discomfort of that arrangement, generals sleeping in heated rooms while privates froze in ditches, was real, and the generals who acknowledged it were being honest. But the alternative was worse. A general who slept like his soldiers would decide like a man who had not slept. And men who had not slept made the kinds of decisions that filled graves. The legacy of this recognition extends far beyond the military. The post-war decades saw the emergence of sleep science as a legitimate field of medical research, driven in part by military-funded studies examining the relationship between rest and cognitive performance under stress. The military's institutional investment in commander rest during the war provided some of the earliest systematic data on sleep deprivation in high-stakes decision-making environments. Data that would later inform fields as diverse as aviation safety, surgical scheduling, then nuclear reactor operations, and long-haul trucking regulation. The principle that emerged was universal. When the consequences of error are catastrophic, the humans making decisions must be rested. The war did not discover this truth. Commanders had understood it intuitively for millennia. But the Second World War, with its unprecedented scale, its industrial organization, and its merciless exposure of every weakness in the human machine, transformed an intuition into a doctrine. We do not let commercial airline pilots fly beyond their rest limits today for the same reason that Eisenhower slept in a proper bed in Versailles. Not because comfort is deserved, but because exhaustion kills, and the only difference is the number of people it takes with it. The soldiers who shivered in their foxholes and dozed in 20-minute fragments between artillery barrages did not know, and probably would not have cared, that their generals were sleeping between clean sheets 30 kilometers behind the line. They were thinking about warmth, about silence, about the unbearable weight of their own eyelids and the terror of letting them close for too long. They would not have been comforted to know that their misery was, in a sense, paying for someone else's clarity. But it was. Every order that arrived at the front, every attack launched at the right moment, every retreat authorized before it was too late, and every reinforcement directed to the sector that needed it most, was the product of a mind that had been deliberately, systematically, and unapologetically protected from the exhaustion that was consuming the men who carried those orders out. The sleep of generals was not a scandal. It was a strategy.